All right, so here we are with another midweek installment of Modern Era Translations. And I debated whether or not I was going to do this on Sunday or pick a different translation to do midweek next week. But I've got a lot to cover, and I want to do this time in the midweek. Technically, it's the end of the week because it's Friday evening. But I have quite a bit I want to cover over the next few weeks before we end the class at the end of the year. So I'm going to take this opportunity to do this now. But before we get started, I do have to make a correction that I did on Sunday when I was working through this verse with you guys when we were talking about the plural and singular second person pronouns. I brought up these translations and I made the NASB 20 just like a full yellow, and I made the LSB a full red, indicating that the NASB 20 only indicated it to you, the plural singular distinction only indicated it to you in the footnotes, which would have been all yellow, and the LSB didn't indicate it to you at all. I had a friend of mine who listens. He sent me a message and he said, I'm not sure why you said the LSB was all red when you can see here that they do indicate that it's all of you in the plural. And I was like, oh, you are right. And I said, I don't know how I missed that, but I did. And I don't think I italicized it last week either, which that's how I know I totally missed it because I usually go in and I do all the italics. Uh, but um, but I did say, but they didn't do anything for the second one. So they were very clear on the first one that this is plural, and the second one is singular, but they didn't indicate this in any way. And it's possible uh, and very likely that this could be misunderstood as a continuation of the plural here. So I said, well, to be fair, it should be green for the first one and red for the second one. And so that's that. And I left that as it was. And so I said I would correct it. But in the process of me updating the LSB, I looked at the NASB 20 and realized, oh, this one also should be green to yellow, because they do indicate that this is um, plural on the top here. And so they say, demanded you men like wheat, demanded to sift you men like wheat. And they're the only translation, as far as I can tell, the NSB 20, that captures the masculine um, pronoun here. So even the KJV doesn't capture that in its thee thou distinction. And so they're being very clear that it's the 12 men here. So that's interesting. I don't know. I know Greek will use the masculine even if it is in mixed company, and I think contextually this is talking about the 12. So I'm not suggesting that this is incorrect. I wonder if it's a little over specified, maybe. Um, but contextually, it is the 12, and the 12 are men. So I think that this is totally acceptable. And they footnote the second one that it's Simon. So the first one is you men, which is good. So I said, oh, this one should be a green to yellow transition. So that is my correction there. Interestingly, just this week after I taught this, um, I saw a Facebook post. Whoops, what happened here? Sorry. Facebook post going forward on the King James Bible Texas Receptus Defenders group from this man, Bill Fortenberry. Bill Fortenberry is a someone who defends the Texas Receptus and King James Bible, specifically the King James Bible. And he spends a lot of his time attacking Mark Ward, both on a professional and personal basis. In my opinion, he has a tendency um, to slander sometimes. That's my opinion. You can disagree with me, but he posted this week. Did you know the KJV is the only English translation that consistently preserves the distinction between singular and plural second person pronouns. In Luke 22:31 through 32, Jesus says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee that thy faith fail not, and when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. Notice the pronoun shift. Jesus speaks to all of the disciples with you, plural, then switches to Peter individually with the thee, thy, singular. This switch shows us that Jesus was warning the disciples about the danger of being divided, sifted against each other, instead of standing in strong unity. Christ's prayer was that Peter would be the glue to hold the disciples together. As my new book, False Friends and True Enemies, you can guess who the true enemy is supposed to be here. It's going to be Mark Ward, demonstrates this change in pronouns is the only indicator that Christ was speaking of the disciples as a group at the beginning of a statement, and then speaking of Peter as an individual for the last part. Modern translations lose this critical distinction, and with it, layers of biblical meaning your congregation needs to understand. Okay, so uh, modern translations lose this critical distinction. These didn't lose it. These didn't lose it. The only one in this list that lost it was the NKJV. Now, I know because some people did point this out to him. He would say, well, it's the only one that consistently does it. Okay, well, your example was this one, and you also said that that modern translations lose this critical distinction, and they generally don't. And so, when it comes to consistency, I will just say this: if it's there contextually, then it's consistent. If you lose out on it contextually, then I'll say it's inconsistent. But generally speaking, uh, I would say that these translations do a pretty good job of being consistent. And no translation is perfectly consistent on every feature. I will say that KJV is, I think, pretty much perfectly consistent on the thee, thou pronoun and you, your pronoun distinctions. Um, and I'm sure if someone can this is what the KJV translator said, and so I agree with them. If this can be misunderstood, people will misunderstand it. So if they don't give a perfect, if it seems evident contextually to most people, but one person could take it out of context and misunderstand it, then they will. They'll absolutely do it. Um, that's generally their character. If they can misunderstand it, they will. But in these ones, I think it's clear. They grab it with the footnote or they do it in the text, and I think some do it better than others, which is why I highlighted them this way. But it doesn't matter. You're getting it in the modern translation, and just like I said last week, we're not getting rid of the KJV. Okay, you could still use the KJV um, to check this stuff. So we're not onlyists. You can use the KJV if you want to be sure that you understand whether or not the pronoun is plural or singular. Anyway, I thought this was just funny that I literally just finished teaching about this and then this example came up. And to be totally fair, this is how I used to teach it. I used to say the exact same things. And I'm glad that eventually I was corrected and I changed my position on this. But I said the exact same thing. I could have written this post 10 years ago and it would have been me, except I wouldn't have published a book on it. So that's that. All right, moving on. So let's see. We need to go to. We finished last week with talking about picking a primary translation, and the NASB family is Green Flag Translation. And so moving on to the next one. So what I've been doing is introducing the next translation in the year that it came out, and then walking that translation through its current publication. So that's what we did with the NASB. And so now we're going to go back to the 1950s. Okay, so back to the 1950s, around the time of the release of the RSV. Remember, during these years that we're talking about, these early mid 20th century timeline, that the KJV is still number one in sales, and it's still most people's primary translation as well. The KJV is still going strong at this time. And during this time, we're going to meet up with a man by the name of Kenneth N. Taylor. Kenneth N. Taylor was the director of Moody Press, and every day, Kenneth would take the train to his work in Chicago and then ride it back home and to his family, which included his 10 children. He had 10 children. And every night, Kenneth would do his devotions with his would do devotions with his kids, and he would do them from the KJV. And every night, Kenneth would explain to his children what the KJV was saying by paraphrasing it after reading it. And then one night, it said one of his daughters asked probably one of the most insightful questions. She said, "But Daddy, if that's what it means, why doesn't it just say so?" And that struck a chord with him. He took this question very seriously, and he would adopt the ASV later for later English and later scholarship, but still found it too hard for his children. Um, the Bible was written for children to read as well. And so now Kenneth, every day, he during his train ride to and from work, he would start to write out his paraphrases um, from the ASV and the KJV. And when he did this work, he started with the epistles. And when he finished that collection from the epistles, his paraphrase from the epistles, uh, he called that collection that he had done the Living Letters. Now, since he worked at Moody Press, he took his efforts to Moody Press, but the books that Moody Press would publish at that time were ultimately decided by Moody Bible Institute. Even though he worked there and he was a director, Moody Bible Institute would decide what they publish. The Moody Bible Institute had its concerns about his work. First, the idea of a paraphrased scripture was a major concern. The only types of Bibles released up to this point were very formal on the translation spectrum. And so, also, the second thing that they were concerned about is Kenneth was not an original language scholar. He would consult original language resources, but this was not an area he was credentialed in. And ultimately, Moody Bible Institute would reject his work. Kenneth reportedly took his work to a number of other publishers as well, and every single one of them turned him down. Kenneth and his wife, Margaret, took all of their savings and they self published the Living Letters. And this publishing venture would be called Tyndale House Publishing, named after his hero, William Tyndale, who translated the Bible with the plowboy in mind. The idea of translating the Bible in such a way so that it was accessible to even the uneducated was his dream and his drive. His letters, though, would eventually fall into the hands of Billy Graham, and Billy Graham would read the Living Letters, and he absolutely loved them. He promoted them heavily on his crusades, if you know about the history of Billy Graham there. And that promotion boosted the Living Letter sales massively. And this created a huge increase in revenue that allowed Kenneth to finish paraphrasing the entire Bible. And so the Living Bible was finished and published in 1971. And that's the very same year that NASB 71 was released. But the reception for the Living Bible was massively successful. Millions of copies were sold when it was released, and the Living Bible would be the first Bible to consistently outsell the KJV. But it didn't just outsell the KJV itself, it outsold every single book that was being sold. It was the number one selling book for several years. And as far as Bible sales are concerned, the Living Bible dominated the market. 46% of all Bibles sold were from the Living Bible. However, it wasn't all roses. The Living Bible was a product of one man, and it was a paraphrase. And translation philosophy became hotly debated because of this Bible, because it was receiving such huge support from the masses. And we've talked about this in class. Paraphrase Bibles are tend to go too far on the spectrum to be a reliable translation. But despite its success, the United Bible Society came out publicly against the Living Bible and encouraged people to stop using it because it was a paraphrase and because it was the work of a single man, and that particular man was not credentialed to do this kind of work. So sales for the Living Bible began to decline, but the success of the Living Bible paved the way for other less formal translations, which we'll talk about later. Now, Kenneth remained the president of Tyndale House Publishing until 1984, when he handed it over to his son. And a couple of years later, due to the public marketing done against the Living Bible, against the Living Bible's lack of scholarship and pushback on paraphrase Bibles, there's also accusations that he made paraphrastic translation decisions that would bias interpretive conclusions to favor that of the Plymouth Brethren, which was the denomination he was a part of. So those at Tyndale House, he's no longer the president at this point. Those at Tyndale House asked Kenneth if they could update his work with good scholarship, and move it out of the paraphrase and into a legitimate translation. Kenneth, humble man, he said yes. Obviously, his dream is to keep it accessible for children and for those who are less educated. And so that's going to be the goal, is to move it out of paraphrase, but still keep it very accessible and make it scholarly. And Kenneth agreed to let his Living Bible receive that revision. And over the next 10 years, 90 original language scholars worked diligently to provide an update to the Living Bible. Those 90 scholars represented a number of evangelical Protestant denominations, including Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Assemblies of God, Church of Christ, and Anglican. And the two men I have up here that I want to just point out that would serve on this committee would be Thomas Schreiner on the left here and Douglas Moo. And they are some of the most well-respected original language scholars out there and theological giants, if I can say that. I bring their names up because these two in particular are going to be impactful down the road. And this is really where they started their work on translating for a Bible. And they both served on this. And what a grab to get these two men to be able to work together on this translation, um, among the other 90. And none of them are slouches in any way. They're all very well credentialed. But these two men are just, I'm pointing them out because they're going to be impactful to other translations later. So, the New Living Translation was born in 1996 as an official update to the Living Bible that would ultimately be translated from the Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. While the Living Bible was the base text, the NLT looks vastly different than the Living Bible. So the Living Bible represented more of an inspiration for the NLT than a true base text, which is why I use dotted lines here. So you can see these dotted lines here. So the ASV is kind of a base text for the Living Bible, but they're so vastly different. You wouldn't recognize them as one being a revision of the other because of how different they are. And so it's a base text, but it's a paraphrase of that base text. And this is moving it out of a mostly paraphrase to a more accessible and legitimate translation as well. So there's quite a significant difference there as well. So the NLT would go through a number of revisions. So the 1996 was when the Complete Bible had its initial release. In 2004, it received a minor update, 2007, 2013, and the 2015 is the current publication. So if you go out and buy an NLT today, you will get the 2015 edition. So as we dive into the preface here, one of the main factors of the Living Bible is that it was written to be read aloud. Okay, and I really appreciate this. And so this is what it has to say in the preface as far as a motivating factor for the NLT. It is evident in Scripture that the biblical documents were written to be read aloud, often in public worship. See Nehemiah 8 or Luke 4:16 through 20, 1 Timothy 4:13, Revelation 1:3. It is still the case today that more people will hear the Bible read aloud in church than are likely to read it for themselves. That's a sobering thought, that the place that people are actually going to hear the Bible will be in church instead of reading it for themselves. But there it is. So they're focusing on making sure that it's that they wrote it to be read aloud. Therefore, a new translation must communicate with clarity and power when it is read publicly. Clarity was the primary goal for the NLT translators, not only to facilitate private reading and understanding, but to ensure that it would be excellent for public reading and make an immediate and powerful impact on any listener. I think this is a really helpful way in understanding what the priorities of the NLT were. They wanted a translation that could be read aloud without stumbling over it, and that kept the sense of the scripture clear. Okay, moving on down their translation. Translation issues. This is a subheading in their preface. The translators have made a conscious effort to provide a text that can be easily understood by the typical reader of modern English. To this end, we sought to use only vocabulary and language structures in common use today. We avoided using language that was likely to become quickly dated or that reflects only a narrow subdialect, with the goal of making the new translation as broadly useful and timeless as possible. But our concern for readability goes beyond concerns of vocabulary and sentence structure. We are also concerned about the historical and cultural barriers to understanding the Bible, and we have sought to translate terms shrouded in history and culture in ways that could be immediately understood. And then they go on to this end, and we'll get there, but I want to cover a couple of things before we get into their examples, or before we get into their translation philosophy. So I'm not going to cover all of that at length, but what I want to appreciate here is that they made this very clear, that they are using vocabulary and language structures in common use today, and avoided using language that was likely to become dated very quickly, meaning they're not using the latest fad language. They are using um, language that has been around for a long time and is going to stick around. And so we see fads in language come and go frequently. I saw it growing up. I see it in my kids. But I also recognize words and phrases and structures that my parents used, that I used, that my grandparents used, that my kids use. And this is the majority of our common vernacular. It's generations deep and unlikely to change quickly. And this is a good example of common vernacular that isn't a sub-dialect of English. Someone said something to me just the other day. They said, "Oh, okay, you want to change church language for street language." And I said, "No, I want the common language to remain common, because the Bible was written in common language. And I want to use common language to reflect that." But it's hard to get that across to people. So here's their so to this end, they are going to convert measurements, right? So there are a lot of biblical weights and distances and other measurements, such as cubits and bushels and so on and so forth. So what they're going to do is they're going to provide the direct source language measurements in the footnotes, but in the text, they're going to use conversions, American conversions. Other translations like the NASB and the ESV will provide direct source measurements in the text, and then the American equivalents in the footnotes. Okay, so here they're flipping it. They're just going to put the conversion in the text and the source language in the footnotes. Some translations do the opposite. The next thing is they're going to also do the same thing with currency. Okay, Same as measurements, the NLT is going to convert things like shekels and denarii into American equivalents and provide the direct source translation in the footnotes. Again, some translations, generally the more formal ones, will do the opposite. This will be a matter of preference, honestly, to provide the source translation in the text and the conversions in the footnotes, or vice versa. I'll tell you what I prefer, just personally. Okay. So, personally, I prefer to have the conversion in the text and the direct translation in the footnotes. And the main reason why is the reason the NLT already stated, for hearing the Bible out loud. When it comes to reading it, it really doesn't matter to me which way it's done, because I'll read the text and then I'll immediately read the footnote right after, regardless of which way it is. I'm going to read that footnote right away. So when it comes to reading, doesn't matter to me. But when it comes to hearing the text, whether it's by audiobook or by the preacher, I find it significantly better, in my personal opinion, to have the conversion in the text, because it helps me understand the value or the size or the weight of the object in question, because I can kind of visualize it. I don't know all the biblical conversions by memory, and the ones I do know, I still have to run the numbers in my head to get an idea of what we're talking about. And the time it takes me to run that conversion in my head uh, has broken my train of thought. I might have missed something. It's just a little stumbling block, and I prefer to. I just prefer, just give me the straight conversion, and I'll read the source language measurement in the footnote. So that's the main reason I prefer to have the converted amounts in my text and the source language translation in the footnotes. I remember driving to work, and I do this all the time actually, and um, I think the CSB was probably the first Bible I read that did that, where they put the converted value in the text and the source language in the footnote. And so it was the first translation I had read that had done that. And I was listening to it as an audiobook. And I think I was listening to the measurements for the ark in Genesis. And I'm pretty sure that's what I was listening to. And I remember just being able to really get a visual sense in my mind as I was listening to how big the ark was. When before, I'm trying to do the conversion in my head, and this was just easier. Allowed me to focus, allowed me to get a sense of the size real quick, and yeah, and move on without breaking the flow of the thought. So, like I said, it's going to be personal preference. For me personally, I prefer to have the converted amount right in the text and then the source language directly in the footnote. Um, this one, giving equivalent dates. Now, this one's actually a really interesting one. So, an example of this is in Ezra 6:15 in the NLT. It says the temple was completed on March 12th during the 6th year of King Darius's reign. And then they have the footnote. The footnote says, Aramaic on the third day of the month Adar of the ancient Hebrew lunar calendar. A number of events in Ezra can be cross-checked with dates in surviving Persian records that accurately and related accurately to our modern calendar. This day was March 12th, 515 BC. Now, to me, this is super helpful in understanding what day it happened, what time of year it was. And while many translations convert units of measurement and currency, very few do this with dates. In fact, to the degree that I looked up nearly every translation, and the only translation I have that did this was the NLT, as far as I could tell. I don't remember if I checked the NET. The NAT has copious footnotes, so I'm sure it probably covered it. But regular Bibles that don't have the amount of footnotes that the NAT does, I don't think any of them had it. Very few even had a footnote indicating what the conversion might be. But what I did find interesting is that the Geneva Bible was one of those few. So I thought that was cool. Now, as I looked into this, because I was curious, wow, that is really specific that they could narrow it down to March 12th, 515 BC. I was surprised by the amount of agreement on this date, and it was nearly universally agreed upon that it was March 12th. I will say, however, that there was some disagreement as to whether or not it was 515 BC or 516 BC. The majority was definitely on the side of 515 BC for what it's worth. Okay, but I still found this pretty helpful. Again, this will be a matter of preference to have this conversion in the text or in the footnotes. And I'll say I appreciate this sort of thing. Others may not. It's going to be personal preference. The NLT is the only translation I have that does this here, and so I appreciate that. I use the NLT a lot, and so this is something I reference pretty regularly. Next thing, um, all right, so this is another one, giving equivalent times. Giving equivalent times. This is another one that translations do as well as the NLT. For example, in the Synoptic Gospels, you can read about what's going on at the ninth hour while Jesus was on the cross. The ninth hour. Well, if you don't know what the ninth hour is in reference to, you might think it was the ninth hour he was on the cross, like maybe he was on the cross for 9 hours. Or you might think that it was 9 a.m., or you might think that it was 9 p.m. But because this is a Jewish calendar and the Jewish calendar starts at 6 a.m., in contrast to our calendar, that starts at midnight. So the ninth hour on a Jewish calendar is actually 3 p.m. So the NLT puts in 3 p.m. where an original language direct translation would put in the ninth hour. This also gets very helpful when you start reading between the Gospels and you realize that, like, John is using a Roman calendar and the Synoptic Gospels are using a Jewish calendar. And so you're looking at your times and the times aren't actually lining up. On a translation that's doing the conversions for you, the times do line up. And you'll only pick up on it because you'll actually look at the footnotes where you'll see, oh, there's a discrepancy here. But because the conversion is in the text, it should force you to dig in and figure out, oh, okay, there's two different calendars that are being used here. Also, when the source text is more general, they will put terms like dusk or dawn instead of a specific time, which I think is good. And again, some of these conversions I can do really quickly in my head, but I like that it's right in the text for me. Next one, providing meanings to names and footnotes. So to me, this one's actually a little unnecessary because so many of the names in the Bible have their names, have their meanings of their names right in the text. But for many others, the NLT provides a breakdown of what that name means. Sometimes this is significant, sometimes it's not. Again, I'm all about having more help, but to me, this one is not as a helpful thing as some of the others are. But hey, I'm all for it. Bring on the extra help. Um, I'm sure someone will appreciate it. Uh, Providing insight into cultural practices. This is another area I find the NLT to be really helpful. There are times when cultural practices are mentioned in the Bible, but if you don't know what they are, they may not. You may not know exactly what they mean. For example, if I said, "Go ahead and get that done," we got the thumbs up. In America, that is immediately understood that we got the green light. It's okay to proceed. Thumbs up is a good thing. But in different cultures, thumbs up is vulgar and highly offensive. So you would need, it's good to have those sorts of cultural practices. Um, what's the culture? Yeah, those cultural practices somewhat defined for you. And so the NLT helps to provide that insight as to how these cultural practices should be interpreted. Like in Luke 23:48, it says, when the crowd that came to see the crucifixion saw what happened, they went home in deep sorrow. In the Greek and many formal translations, it says they went home beating their breasts. Here, they let you know that beating their breasts is a cultural practice that, like, similar to like our thumbs up or thumbs down, but for them it signifies deep sorrow. So this could help prevent some confusion as to what might be happening or misinterpretations as to the emotions that are felt. Maybe some people might think it's anger instead of deep sorrow. I know I've thought about this as being anger in the past. Think of like I know this is how I thought about it. Like a gorilla when it's beating its chest, and that's what I saw in my mind was like they're just angry, so they're just beating their chest. Um, but it actually means deep sorrow. I was a kid when I thought that. I learned later, but still, this would have helped me know as a kid, as someone that was less educated. That's the goal here to pick up on this. Uh, uh, let's see. This is very illuminate metaphorical language as well. So this is very noticeable for me in places like Song of Songs, in which physical compliments are given frequently, and to our ears, they kind of sound funny. Um, like your teeth are like sheep and things of that nature. The NLT here helps make them a little bit more understandable, and so that's helpful. Structure, poetry, and poetic format. So most translations will do this for you today. You'll notice that poetry is structured in a poetic format and not in a just line by line, verse by verse. So you can immediately identify, oh, we're in poetry now. Um, like you would know that in Psalms right away, but it's helpful to see if, like in the Old Testament, they broke out into poetry in places. And it also was the first time I realized that Job was poetry, was when I looked at it in a modern translation and I saw it in poetic format. And I didn't know that prior to that. All right. Um, distinguish the Jews contextually between the people and the leadership, particularly in the Gospel of John. So this one is occasionally you're going to see like a generic reference in some translations that just say the Jews. And here they're taking the context and they're letting you know if the Jews are the Jews being represented by the leadership, like the scribes, Pharisees, priests, or something of that nature, or if it's the Jews contextually by like the crowd of people, the people that are there, and how they're responding. And so the NLT, particularly in the Gospel of John, will distinguish the Jews between the people and the leadership. And you'll see a footnote when they do that. And so I found that somewhat helpful as well. Actually, I do find that helpful just for clarity's sake. Um, I can't say that I ever thought about it and thought, oh, I misunderstood that, but I could see how someone could misunderstand that. And so again, I'm happy that it's there. They're going to render gendered language accurately. We're going to cover that in its own lesson. So we're just going to move past this one. I think it's going to not be this Sunday, but the Sunday following is the lesson that will hit that gendered language. Concordance and technical language. I'm just going to read right from what they have to say in the footnote, because not in the footnote, in the preface. I'm going to read what they have to say in the preface because I think it's good, and I don't think I could say it better than the way they said it. So I'm just going to read it. So they write lexical consistency in terminology. For the sake of clarity, we have translated certain original language terms consistently. So they're talking about concordance here. We've talked about this before, especially within synoptic passages and for commonly repeated rhetorical phrases, and within certain word categories such as divine names and non theological technical terminology. Examples: liturgical, legal, cultural, zoological, and botanical terms. For theological terms, we have allowed a greater semantic range of acceptable English words or phrases for a single Hebrew or Greek word. We have avoided some theological terms that are not readily understood by many modern reasons. For example, we have avoided using words such as justification and sanctification, which are carryovers from Latin translations. In place of these words, we have provided renderings such as made right with God and made holy, which I think are good equivalents. I like, so the NLT is not my primary translation. It's a translation I source that I do my research from sometimes. Not sometimes, I do it nearly every day, but I do my research on. It is one of the resources I use for that. And I have to say, as a secondary Bible, because that's what it is for me, as a secondary Bible, um, I like this. I like that they just put in made right with God or made holy. but when I'm but I also like the technical language. I like that carryover from the Latin translations because that really helps connect me to church history, and I don't want to lose that connection entirely. So, um, I have Bibles that make sure that that traditional language stays, and I have Bibles that make it more modern. And I think it's a good balance to have both. The CSB does a really good job of providing both, usually one in the text and one in the footnote. Uh, and I think it does a good job in that way. So that's usually my first cue. But I appreciate that the NLT does this for clarity, especially for people who maybe aren't familiar with Christianese, right? Christian language terms, to just have the terms laid out for them in plain English. So it's definitely helpful for a new Christian, but I would want, I wouldn't want to get rid of this technical language. I appreciate it. So I'm just saying both are helpful and useful. That's what I'm trying to say. So use both because they're helpful and useful. Now, the heart of Kenneth remained. The heart that he had was to make the Bible accessible to as many people as possible. But this time, the work was done by credentialed scholars, and they moved it out of the paraphrase, the Living Bible, out of the paraphrase into the fringes of the functional category. And the NLT has remained, for me, one of my favorite translations for doing edifying comparative work. And I've already showed you that it does a great job at retaining idioms and wordplay. So, for example, we talked about this already in a previous class, but that wordplay in Amos 2, I'm not going to rehash this, but you can go back to, I think it's my class on what makes for an accurate translation. Um, I use the NLT there to talk about wordplay, and it can help retain that wordplay to help us understanding what's happening in the Hebrew that more literal Bibles struggle to do, if not fail outright. And I can give you more examples in which the NLT just really helps clear up the meaning and demonstrate wordplay as to what's happening. But I also found spots that I was like, oh, wait, I don't love that. And so I'll just show you a couple of those as we start to close out the NLT. Uh, Not that long ago, if you guys remember, Pastor was teaching out of Ecclesiastes. And a while back, he did admit that Ecclesiastes was a difficult book to translate. But when Pastor got to this verse, I think he handled it very well, but I remember reading it in the NLT and feeling like it was super anachronistic, like unnecessarily anachronistic. The concepts of, so I'll read the two verses. So in the CSB, it says, if you see the oppression of the poor and perversion of justice and righteousness in the province, don't be astonished at the situation because one official protects another official and higher officials protect them. Okay. That's super clear. I understand exactly what's happening here. The NLT, they make it a little bit more clear. It says, don't be surprised if you see a poor person being oppressed by the powerful and if justice is being miscarried throughout the land. For every official is under orders from higher up, and matters of justice get lost in red tape and bureaucracy. And I was good with that whole translation up until that last line, red tape and bureaucracy. That is the concepts of red tape and bureaucracy are very modern day vernacular, as far as I can tell. And though I think it can accurately describe what's going on, it's really not exactly what's being said there. So this is very paraphrastic in this way. And you can see this, there's some, that's why I said it's on the fringe edges of functional translation. It's very much a functional translation, and every translation rides on that spectrum. But this one tends to be on the uh, it gets close to paraphrase, and sometimes outright does paraphrase in some verses. But generally, that's not the case. That's not the whole translation like that. That's places here and there, but it does ride that edge more frequently. And so for that reason, I do call the NLT a yellow flag translation. And the only reason why is because it fails to be on that centrist spectrum of translation philosophy. And I'm going to be honest, this is probably going to be the one that most people are going to get controversial with me on. Oh, I say that. There might be other ones as well. Um, I love this translation. I think it's a fantastic study help. I use it nearly every single day. I would absolutely recommend it to everyone to have in their library and use it in conjunction with their primary Bible. But I do know that there are a number of churches who have adopted this translation as their teaching translation, and it's consistently on the top 10 selling Bibles for the year regularly. The scholars are good evangelical scholars. They have some of the best scholars on this translation team, and the translation is being maintained. It has a good track record of being dealt with positively in commentaries. And the biggest criticism I have for it is that sometimes it can be too free with its renderings. I wish it was a little tighter to the source language. And for that reason, I make it a yellow flag translation because I want to be consistent. But I do think this is overall a good translation. Otherwise, like as far as yellow flag translations are concerned, it's might be my favorite one. It might be the best one out there, with the exception of maybe the LEB, which is on the it's the other side. We're not going to talk about the LEB, but the LEB would be on the outside of or outside of the centrist spectrum on the formal end. So the LEB is the other Bible I reference nearly daily, but on the other end of the spectrum where it's super formal. So those are both my two favorite yellow flag translations, and they're both have the X for the same reason. Just one's on the paraphrase side, and the other is on the formal side, or I should say, one's on the functional side and one's on the formal side. All right. So up to this point, thus far, we have seen translations that have been primarily being the revision of some other work that went before them. And so next week, or this coming Sunday, we're going to talk about whether or not that has to be the case. So this is where we're going to pick up next week. And I hope you all found this helpful. But this is where the class is going to end for today. And again, highly recommend the NLT. I think you should have it in your library and definitely use it in conjunction with your primary translation. Thank you for taking the time to listen. You all are dismissed.